In June of 2025, the government of a sovereign nation opened a ballot, not an election, a ballot for citizens to apply to leave their own country permanently before it's gone. Within 4 days, more than a third of the entire population had already applied. That country is Tuvalu. And what's happening there right now isn't a prediction, isn't a model, isn't something scheduled for some distant, comfortable future decade. It's happening this year, with real people making a real, legally binding decision about whether to stay in the country they were born in or leave before the ocean makes that decision for them. Somewhere between one government office issuing that ballot and the moment you're watching this video, thousands of individual families sat down and decided the safest bet for their children's future was to leave the only country their family had ever known. So here's the question. This video is going to answer, using elevation data, sea level measurements, and the actual legal agreements governments are signing right now. Which countries are next? Which ones are closest to the edge by the numbers, not by speculation? What does disappearing actually mean when a country still technically has land above water, but can no longer support the people living on it? And what happens, legally, to a nation that has run out of habitable ground? Most videos on this topic show you a scary elevation chart and call it a day. This one is different because the most important development in this entire story isn't a number on a chart at all. It's a legal document, signed and already in force, that answers a question nobody in international law had ever had to answer before. What happens to a country's sovereignty when its physical territory can no longer be lived on? That answer already exists. It's already been tested. And by the time we reach the top of this ranking, you'll understand exactly why it matters to every other country on this list. And eventually to places with populations in the tens of millions, not the tens of thousands. This is endgame analysis. Let's rank them, starting with how we measure something as strange and unprecedented as a country running out of country. Before the ranking, it's worth being precise about what we're actually measuring, because disappearing is doing a lot of work in that title. And the honest version of this story is more specific and, frankly, more interesting than a simple countdown to total submersion. It's also worth saying plainly, nothing in this ranking should be read as certain doom for every person in every country listed here. These are trajectories built on current data and current rates of change, not unchangeable destinies, and several of the governments involved are actively fighting to slow or adapt to what the numbers currently show. Almost none of the countries on this list are projected to have every square meter of their land vanish beneath the waves by 2100 in mainstream climate models. What actually happens first, and what's already happening in several cases, is a combination of factors that add up to the same practical outcome. Capital cities going underwater during high tides and storm surges, the majority of habitable, farmable land becoming unusable, freshwater aquifers turning undrinkable as seawater seeps in from below, and populations being forced into partial or total relocation. A country doesn't need its last inch of land submerged to functionally disappear as a place where people can actually live. It just needs to become unlivable for the people who are supposed to live there. So the ranking criteria that actually matters, the ones that data supports, are these. Average elevation above sea level, since that determines how much sea level rise it actually takes to threaten the whole territory. Measured rate of sea level rise specifically at that location, since it varies significantly by region due to ocean currents and land movement, not just the global average. Frequency of flood days, since chronic, repeated flooding destroys freshwater and farmland long before a single dramatic flood does. And, where it exists, direct evidence of land that has already physically disappeared, not projected to disappear, already gone. Rank countries by those 4 factors together, and you get a list that looks different from a simple who's closest to sea level chart, and considerably more urgent. One more thing worth establishing before the ranking begins. This list deliberately focuses on nations where the entire country, or the overwhelming majority of its population and territory, faces this threat, rather than large countries with vulnerable coastal regions. That's a real and important distinction. Countries like Bangladesh, Vietnam, Egypt, and Nigeria all have enormous populations, living in low-lying, high-risk coastal and delta zones, and the raw number of people threatened in those countries individually can exceed the entire combined population of every nation further down this list. But those are large nations with high ground, alternative regions, and, in most cases, far greater fiscal and diplomatic resources to adapt with. The countries on this list don't have that luxury. When the coast is threatened in a country the size of the ones we're about to rank, there often isn't an inland alternative to retreat to. The coast is the country. Starting at number 10 and moving toward the most urgent case, because the closer we get to number 1, the more this stops being about elevation charts and starts being about an actual government actually planning for an actual ending. Number 10, Bangladesh, and this one belongs on the list for a different reason than every other entry, which makes it a useful contrast. Bangladesh isn't a small island nation with a population in the thousands or tens of thousands. It's a country of roughly 170 million people. And while the whole nation isn't disappearing, its low-lying delta regions are experiencing some of the most severe displacement pressure on the planet, with rising seas, river erosion, and increasingly violent cyclones combining to threaten tens of millions of people's homes directly. If you want to understand the scale difference between a tiny island nation losing its entire territory and a massive country losing a critical, densely populated region, Bangladesh is the number that makes that difference concrete. Number 9, the Bahamas. Unlike every other entry on this list, the Bahamas sits in the Atlantic, not the Pacific, which matters because it shows this isn't a single ocean problem. New Providence Island, home to the country's capital and the overwhelming majority of its population, is facing accelerating coastal erosion and storm surge exposure. It's a wealthier, more developed nation than most of the countries further down this list, and that matters too, because it demonstrates that money and infrastructure can slow this threat down, but the underlying physics doesn't care how developed your seawalls are if the sea keeps rising faster than you can build them. The Bahamas inclusion here is also a reminder that hurricane intensity, not just gradual sea level creep, is part of this story. Warmer ocean water fuels stronger storm surges, meaning the country doesn't just face a slow motion rise in the waterline, it faces that same rising baseline getting hit repeatedly by increasingly powerful storms layered on top of it. Number 8, the Solomon Islands. This is the entry that should genuinely unsettle you, because unlike almost everything else in this video, it isn't a projection. At least 5 entire reef islands belonging to the Solomon Islands have already disappeared beneath the sea, not eroded, not partially flooded. Gone, physically gone, wiped off the map in the recent past, not in some 100-year model. Spanning nearly 30,000 square kilometers and home to over 800,000 people, the Solomon Islands is proof that this isn't a future problem waiting to start. It already started. Researchers studying the Lost Islands found that wave energy and accelerating sea level rise, working together, were enough to erase land that communities had lived on and farmed for generations. And coastal villages elsewhere in the archipelago are already having to relocate as the shoreline keeps eating into settled land. Number 7, Vanuatu. The United Nations has formally designated Vanuatu the world's most vulnerable country to natural disasters, a ranking that combines its exposure to cyclones with the same sea level threat facing every other Pacific nation on this list. The compounding effect matters here. A country that's already absorbing severe storm damage on a regular basis has far less capacity to also fund the seawalls, land reclamation, and infrastructure hardening that slower-moving, wealthier nations can afford. Vanuatu has, in recent years, been among the most vocal Pacific nations pushing for international legal recognition of climate-displaced people as a distinct category, precisely because its government understands it may need that legal framework sooner than most. Number 6, Tonga, another low-lying Pacific archipelago facing the same combination of chronic erosion and storm surge vulnerability as its neighbors, with the added complication that Tonga's population is scattered across more than 150 islands, meaning any relocation or adaptation strategy has to be repeated across dozens of separate, small, difficult-to-reach communities rather than executed once for a single landmass. Number 5, Nauru, the third smallest country on Earth by land area, which means it has essentially no margin for error and nowhere to retreat to internally. Coastal erosion is already actively undermining its shoreline, and saltwater intrusion is already threatening what limited freshwater supply the country has. Nauru's small size, which sounds like it should make problems easier to manage, actually works against it here. There's no higher ground to relocate to within the country's own borders, no interior region unaffected by what's happening at the coast, because in a country this small, everywhere is close to the coast. Nauru's history also compounds the problem in an unusual way. Decades of phosphate mining in the 20th century already left much of the island's interior stripped and largely uninhabitable, meaning the population is concentrated on a narrow, already vulnerable coastal strip with essentially no functional backup terrain even before sea level rise is factored in at all. Number 4, the Marshall Islands. Most of its islands sit just 2 to 3 meters above sea level, and unlike the more abstract projections further up this list, land loss here is already visibly happening in real time. In Majuro, the capital, land that used to stand above the waterline, has already sunk beneath the ocean. The country's total land area, only 181 square kilometers to begin with, smaller than many single cities, is shrinking year by year, measurably, not theoretically. Major flooding events, once rare enough to be remembered as singular disasters, have become frequent enough in recent decades that the government now treats them as a recurring planning problem rather than an occasional emergency, budgeting for damage and displacement the way other nations budget for routine infrastructure maintenance. Number 3, the Maldives. And this is where the numbers stop being merely concerning and start being almost impossible to fully process. The Maldives holds the record for the lowest average elevation of any country on Earth, just 1.5 meters above sea level, with its highest point anywhere in the entire nation reaching only 2.3 meters. More than 80% of its land area sits less than 1 meter above the current sea level. If projections hold, as much as 80% of the Maldives' roughly 1,100 islands could become uninhabitable by 2050, not 2100, 2050, within the working lifetime of most people watching this video. The Maldives isn't a tourism postcard with a distant, abstract climate problem attached to it. It's a country whose entire physical existence is measured in single meters, and the ocean doesn't need many of them. The Maldives economy makes its situation especially precarious in a way that doesn't show up in elevation charts alone. Tourism accounts for the overwhelming majority of the country's GDP, and nearly all of that tourism infrastructure, the resorts, the airports, the overwater bungalows that make the country famous, sits directly on the same low-lying land facing the highest inundation risk. A country losing habitable land is one crisis. A country losing habitable land that also happens to be the physical foundation of almost its entire economy is a compounding crisis, one where climate adaptation and economic survival can't be separated from each other the way they can in larger, more diversified economies. Number 2, Kiribati, spread across 33 atolls and islands, scattered over 3.5 million square kilometers of Pacific. Ocean, with an average elevation of just 3 meters. Sea levels around Kiribati are rising at approximately 1.2 centimeters per year, 4 times the global average rate, which means whatever timeline you're picturing for the rest of the world, cut it to a quarter for Kiribati specifically. Here's the number that makes this concrete rather than abstract. Regions of Kiribati that currently experience fewer than 5 flood days a year are projected to experience an average of 65 flood days a year by the 2050s. That's not a single catastrophic flood event decades from now. That's going from occasional flooding to flooding roughly 1 out of every 5 to 6 days within 30 years as the new normal. Underground wells are already being contaminated by encroaching seawater, and salt is already leaching into agricultural soil, degrading the country's ability to grow its own food well before the land itself is fully submerged. Kiribati's government reached its own conclusion about what this means years ago and has already purchased land in Fiji, a formal hedge against the possibility that its own territory becomes permanently unable to sustain its population. That land purchase deserves a moment of its own attention because it was a genuinely unusual move for a sitting government to make. Kiribati didn't wait for an international body to offer resettlement terms, and it didn't wait until the crisis was undeniable. It went out, years in advance, and bought several thousand acres on a neighboring island nation, explicitly as insurance against the possibility that its own citizens might one day need somewhere else to go. It was, in effect, a smaller, quieter, less legally formalized version of exactly the kind of forward planning Tuvalu would later turn into a full binding treaty. Kiribati saw the same writing on the wall. It just didn't yet have a partner willing to put it into the kind of legally binding language Australia eventually offered Tuvalu. Which brings us to number 1, and to the country this entire video opened with, because Tuvalu isn't just the most physically vulnerable nation on this list by the numbers, it's also the only one that has already moved past planning and into active, legal, real-world execution of what happens next. The raw numbers alone would put Tuvalu near the top of any list like this. Average elevation under 2 meters. Sea levels around Tuvalu have already risen roughly 21 centimeters over the past 30 years, nearly double the global average rate. The United Nations estimates that up to 95% of the country's total land area could face flooding by 2100. NASA's own modeling projects that by that same year, sea levels will have risen by roughly a meter, enough to place 90% of Funafuti, Tuvalu's capital and by far its most populous area, underwater. But the numbers aren't actually what makes Tuvalu the top entry on this list. What makes it number 1 is what its government has already done in response, because Tuvalu has become the first country in human history to legally and formally plan for its own territorial disappearance while still functioning as an active, internationally engaged state. In November of 2023, Tuvalu and Australia signed the Falapili Union Treaty, which entered into force in August of 2024. Read the actual language of that treaty, because it's genuinely unprecedented. It states explicitly that the statehood and sovereignty of Tuvalu will continue, and the rights and duties inherent thereto will be maintained, notwithstanding the impact of climate change-related sea level rise. That sentence exists because Tuvalu's government looked directly at the legal question underlying everything on this list: what happens to a country's sovereignty, its seat at the United Nations, its passports, its entire legal existence, if its physical territory becomes uninhabitable or vanishes, and negotiated an actual binding answer with a major world power, years before that question becomes unavoidable for everyone else on this ranking. The treaty didn't stop at legal recognition. It created a special mobility pathway, a climate visa, allowing up to 280 Tuvaluan citizens each year to move to Australia with full access to health care, education, and childcare, and the freedom to travel back and forth. When the ballot for that first visa pathway opened on June 16, 2025, the response wasn't gradual interest building over months. Within the first 4 days, more than a third of Tuvalu's entire population had already applied. By December of 2025, the first group of Tuvaluan citizens had already relocated to Australia under the agreement, becoming, functionally, among the first people in modern history to formally emigrate under a treaty built specifically around their home country's eventual disappearance. And Tuvalu didn't stop there either. Alongside the treaty, the country has pursued something even stranger and, in its own way, more remarkable: a plan to become the world's first digital nation. According to Tuvalu's own government, the plan is to digitally archive the country's culture, history, and governmental functions so thoroughly that, in the government's own words, this digital transformation will allow Tuvalu to retain its identity and continue to function as a state, even after its physical land is gone. Read that sentence again. A government is planning, in writing, in public, for the scenario in which its physical territory no longer exists, and has decided the answer isn't to simply disappear as a nation when that happens, but to keep functioning as a state entirely in digital and diplomatic space, backed by treaties like the one with Australia that legally lock in its continued sovereignty regardless of what happens to the land itself. That's why Tuvalu tops this ranking. Not just because the elevation numbers are among the worst on Earth, though they are, because it's the only country on this list that has stopped asking, what if this happens, and started building the actual legal, digital, and diplomatic infrastructure for when it does. Step back from the individual countries for a moment, because there's a bigger pattern sitting underneath this entire ranking, and it's the part that should genuinely change how you think about every other at-risk list you'll ever see on this subject again. For decades, the conversation around vanishing island nations treated this as a purely physical problem. Land goes underwater, people leave, story over. What Tuvalu's approach reveals is that the actual hardest problem isn't physical, it's legal and political. International law has never had to seriously answer the question of what happens to a country's sovereignty, its UN membership, its citizens' nationality, when its territory becomes uninhabitable or disappears entirely. Tuvalu didn't wait for that question to be answered by someone else. It negotiated its own answer, directly, with one of its most powerful regional neighbors, and in doing so created the first real precedent the rest of this list, and eventually dozens of other vulnerable nations, will likely need to follow. That's genuinely significant because every other country on this ranking, Kiribati, the Maldives, the Marshall Islands, Nauru, all the way up to number 10, is going to eventually face the exact same legal void Tuvalu just filled for itself. Does a nation without habitable land still get a seat at the United Nations? Do its citizens still hold a nationality that means something internationally? Or do they simply become stateless the moment the last dry ground disappears? Kiribati's government, buying land in Fiji years ago, was already implicitly wrestling with this question without a clean legal answer to point to. Tuvalu just gave every other country on this list a template. There's also a financial dimension to this that rarely makes it into the more sensational versions of this story. Alongside the treaty, Australia committed roughly $25 million specifically to the Tuvalu Coastal Adaptation Project, aimed at physically expanding safe, elevated land along Tuvalu's coastline, plus tens of millions more in broader development assistance, covering everything from a new undersea telecommunications cable to strengthening Tuvalu's sovereign wealth fund. This matters because it shows the Falapili Union isn't purely an exit strategy, a plan for leaving. It's explicitly designed as both. Continued investment aimed at letting people stay and thrive in Tuvalu for as long as physically possible, paired with a dignified, legally guaranteed way out for those who eventually can't. That dual structure, invest to delay the ending while simultaneously preparing for it, may end up being the actual template other vulnerable nations copy, more than the individual climate visa numbers themselves. Here's what makes this ranking different from most countries at risk content you'll find elsewhere. Almost none of it is speculative anymore. The Solomon Islands reef islands aren't projected to disappear, they already have. The Marshall Islands capital isn't projected to start losing land, it already is. Tuvalu isn't planning a hypothetical treaty for some distant decade. The treaty is already in force. The first migrants have already left and the Digital Nation project is already underway. This list isn't a forecast of what might happen. By the end of the century, it's a live progress report on something that started years ago and is measurably accelerating right now. What happens to the 10 countries on this list over the next several decades will very likely become the template, legal, diplomatic, and physical for how the rest of the world eventually handles the much larger populations facing partial displacement in places like Bangladesh, coastal Nigeria, and low-lying parts of Southeast Asia. Small countries, ironically, are running this experiment first, not because their problem is uniquely severe in absolute terms, but because they have the least land and the least time to figure out an answer before the water arrives. There's a reason it makes sense that the smallest, least powerful nations on Earth are the ones pioneering the legal answer to this problem, rather than larger countries with more resources and more diplomatic leverage. Bigger nations facing coastal risk, the United States, China, the UK, Japan, all have the luxury of time and internal land to retreat to, which means none of them have faced real pressure to answer the sovereignty question Tuvalu just answered. Necessity forced the smallest, most vulnerable governments on the planet to solve a legal problem the largest, most powerful governments haven't had to touch yet. That's worth remembering the next time a bigger country's coastal risk makes headlines. The actual playbook for what comes next, legally speaking, is already being written by nations most people couldn't point to on a map. It's worth sitting with one more detail before we close, because it's the detail that ties this entire ranking together into something more than just a list of unlucky geography. Every single country on it, from Bangladesh down to Tuvalu, contributes a genuinely negligible share of the emissions actually driving this crisis. The Marshall Islands has emitted a tiny fraction of 1% of global greenhouse gases since 1990, and yet it's the country losing visible, measurable land right now, this decade, while the largest historical emitters watch from continents that, on the current data, aren't going anywhere for a very long time. That imbalance, who caused this and who's paying for it first, is the quiet argument running underneath every treaty, every purchased plot of land in Fiji, and every ballot line of Tuvaluans applying to leave the only home their country has ever had. If this ranking gave you a clearer, more current picture than the usual list of scary elevation numbers, subscribe to EndGame Analysis, because we're going to keep tracking exactly how Tuvalu's treaty plays out, and whether any other country on this list follows its lead. Tell me in the comments, do you think the rest of the world recognizes a digital nation as a legitimate, permanent form of statehood, or is Tuvalu's plan ultimately a stopgap, not a solution? I read every comment, and they shape what we cover next. This has been EndGame Analysis. Stay sharp.